Welcome back to another episode of the Bleav in Georgia Tech podcast. We are your co-host. That is RJ Schaefer. I'm Jackson Caldwell coming to you on Friday afternoon. Um, Spring football is going on. Basketball is wrapping up. You got baseball, softball going on. Before we get into anything too in depth, I got to ask RJ, how you doing, man? It's been a little bit.
Has been a while, not due to the lack of Georgia Tech news. Um, just very
It's
busy schedules, but we are back.
yeah. It's there's been so much happening since because last show we brought for you, Georgia Tech had just lost a heartbreaker to Notre Dame in the first round. A team that also played in the first round is currently in the first round of the ACC tournament, I might add, and almost lost to Louisville. Like they were trailing in the second half against Louisville, awful team. They're getting ready to possibly advance to the Elite Eight tonight. NC State went on an unbelievable run through the ACC tournament. They have Marquette tonight, and then they will be possibly set up to go to the Final Four. So we will see what they're able to do tonight. But it's I won't just to kind of talk about it just right off the cuff here. The ACC, which I think me and you also took part in some of the bashing a little bit this year. ACC is rolling, really. North Carolina did get upset last night. You had the Virginia debacle in the first four, which a lot of ACC fans don't claim Virginia basketball. Like they hate it as much as anybody else does. But Clemson's in the Elite Eight. You could, if Duke upsets Houston tonight, they can make it. We just discussed NC State. Like I think me and you owe the ACC an apology.
Yeah, and I think we also owe Clemson an apology
I
because
say,
there
yeah,
was a
we owe
point where
apology more than anyone.
we were bashing Clemson for a while, but the ACC, and I think we've kind of talked about this throughout the year. Like the ACC looks a lot stronger than what the media perception is. Like NC State probably would not have gotten in the tournament. Like they needed to win the entire thing, and they've looked amazing. But yeah, I think the idea of the ACC being a weak conference is kind of been disproved through the
Well,
tournament.
and I fell for it again. Like I'm not like I should. I own it. Like I was wrong in my take on that. And this is not the first. Like this is like the third or fourth year. Everybody's kind of, and myself included, kind of underrated the ACC, and then they do really well in the tournament. Just a couple, like 2 years ago, you had North Carolina and Duke facing each other in the Final Four. You've had really good runs. In the past couple of years. So like I'm as guilty of anybody as doing it, but Clemson especially, I picked them to lose in their very first game. I picked them to lose to New Mexico in my bracket, and then they won that, and then that game wasn't close. Like they blew the doors off of New Mexico, and then they beat Baylor and then upset Arizona last night, and they'll face Alabama, who Alabama can be beat. I know Alabama can score, but they're the only college basketball team I think can give up 100 points to like literally anybody on any night and still like you think they're a good team. So, everybody associates the Clemson Alabama postseason games with football, but it's happening in basketball too. So, yeah, just wanted to kind of shout out the ACC in terms of basketball. You could have, again, depending on what Duke and NC State do tonight, you could have as many as 3 teams in the Elite Eight, and then like who knows how many you can get in the Final Four. So it'll be fun to see there. But the one big thing I know that's going on that all Georgia Tech fans want to know about is spring football. They resumed. They were off last week for spring break. They got back. They practiced. I was there Monday and Wednesday, both media viewing periods. We're allowed to see about 15, 20 minutes of action. And then, we talked to coaches and players afterwards. We talked to a special teams coordinator / associate head coach / cornerbacks coach, Ricky Brumfield. He was really insightful. He gave a lot about, the new additions in the through the transfer portal at corner. Warren Burrell from Tennessee, Saeed Gibbs from Rhode Island. Talked about how well those guys are doing right now. He really went in depth about the special teams unit. They're bringing basically everybody back. Aiden Burr's back at kicker, David Shanahan's back at punter. You have Henry Freer long snapping. He was just put on. It was kind of cool to talk to him. He was just put on scholarship, and he came and talked to us a little bit. David Shanahan is Irish, so he's playing Florida State and everything. he talked in depth about that. So that was really cool. And then Wednesday, we talked to Chris Winkie, quarterback's coach and assistant head coach, Chris Winkie. And then we talked to Haynes King and Zach Pyron. That's the first time I can remember talking to Zach Pyron in quite a while. You can go read all the press conference notes and transcripts and everything like that over at allyellowjackets.com. But anything you want to add about any spring football notes? I know it's, we're not allowed to see a ton or anything like that, but they got a scrimmage tomorrow. I remember them saying that the other day in the press conference. So still a couple of weeks away from the spring game, but any spring football notes you wanted to add?
Yeah, I heard the Winky press conference earlier, and one thing I was super excited about that he talked about is these new guys in the quarterback room. Well, you actually talked about him with this. These new guys in the quarterback room, they look really good. And, generally teams talk about a culture, but he believes that these new guys coming in are truly buying into the Brent Key aggressive, do it yourself kind of thing. Just really, I'm really interested with the quarterbacks because he had also talked with Haynes King, and his goal is not to take the aggressiveness away from Haynes King. The goal is you can try and limit the turnovers as much as you can, but you want to keep Haynes King in the game. That's one thing I was really interested in his press conference.
Yeah, I did think that was pretty noteworthy because that's something me and you have talked about. If there was one bad thing you could talk about with this offense is that, Haynes, he turned the ball over a lot, threw 15 interceptions. I believe that led to ACC. And they were kind of a direct result of a few losses. The Boston College game, you had a couple interceptions there in the first half. The Bowling Green loss was not all on the turnovers. The defense was really putrid that game. But then, I think he started trying to force it, and then everything went downhill. And we're not going to rehash all 15 of his interceptions, but I do think that that's the one big area you see on the offense where, like, okay, that's got to get better because you're talking about a team that was number one in rush offense. They got more explosive in the passing game, and I know Buster Faulkner's talked when he talked with us a couple of weeks ago during the first week of spring, and he talked about the offense getting more explosive, and he says the weapons are absolutely there. And might I add, during the media viewing sessions is Leo Blackburn looks really good running routes, doing everything. Like he looks really good running around out there. So that should be something that excites all Yellow Jackets fans out there. I also thought it was interesting to note that, both freshman quarterbacks, Aaron Philo and Graham Knowles, are both enrolled and going through spring practice. And every coach that's went up there and talked, I think except Brumfield, because quarterbacks are not really his area. Brent Key, Buster Faulkner, and Chris Winkie all talked about how well that they're fitting in and adapting. And, like, it's a really good situation for them because even if, everybody wants to know how freshman quarterbacks are doing, like it's always like a hot topic when they first get there. They're in a really good situation where there is no pressure on them to really do anything this year. And I know this is not the only situation across the country where it's like that, but you have a guy in Haynes King who was really good last year, hoping to be even better than he was last year. Zach Pyron has played, has experience, and is also talented. So you got two really good, talented quarterbacks ahead of you, and that allows you to just kind of sit back, learn a little bit, and then when it's their turn to challenge for the starting job, whether that's Haynes King goes to the NFL after this year, maybe 2 years down the road, we'll see. But like every coach has talked about, how they're – I think it was Zach Pyron, he said they're like sponges. They're just soaking everything in and just doing a really good job. They're super competitive. So we'll get into in our spring football preview, we talked about, as far as quarterbacks go, that's what we were kind of most interested in because we kind of know what we have in the other two and, how much you really learn it in the spring anyway. But I thought that was a couple of interesting notes. We're going to talk to Brent Key's going to talk to the media after the scrimmage tomorrow. So on our next podcast, we'll have all kind of notes and little tidbits about that. So we'll be sure to update you then. Be tuned into allyellowjackets.com for the latest on that. I guess the next thing we should get into is, not only is it Sweet 16, Elite Eight season in college basketball, it's, the tournament's rolling around. Transfer portal's open. Some would argue that that's, I think, to the detriment of college basketball is having it open right now during what's supposed to be, like the reigning moment of this is when college basketball has the nation's attention. And, we're not going to have that argument right now. But it is kind of open. And, we're just, I think, I thought it would be good to kind of talk about maybe where we might see Georgia Tech add some transfers. Of course, they have two currently outgoing, Amari Abram and Ebenezer Dewana. They both opted to re-enter the portal. Now, they were two transfers that came back in last year. Abram coming from Ole Miss, Ebenezer coming from NC State. Neither played a ton. Abram started at the first half of the season, but lost his job to Nate George and really didn't get back on it. Ebenezer he floated in and out. I thought he did some things defensively that were pretty good. But as in terms of offense, it was just never there. Wasn't a super great rebounder, even though, Georgia Tech was one of the best rebounding teams in the ACC. I guess I'll ask you this question first. It doesn't have to be a massive transfer portal class, especially, with the 2024 signing class coming in. But you have these two guys going out. You have Kyle Stoudamire going and a couple of others. There's some spots open where you could get some veterans in. What do you think would be good additions?
Yeah, I think what you have to look for is a replacement for Kyle Stoudamire because Kyle Stoudamire had brought a lot to the team. I think you have to look for maybe not necessarily a guard, but a forward that can come off the bench, give you some length, something that was kind of missing at points. Tafari Kapari, to be fair, was that for a while. But you lose Ebenezer, who was he was starting early in the season, but it was more of for him to do the jump ball. Like he played probably 15 minutes a game. So I just think somebody to kind of fill that role that Kyle Stoudamire had, which was, off the bench and can give you a different look than the starters.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I would also it's been a problem for a little bit. And I know Brian Dongo is really good, but I think having a really good defensive minded rebounding center.
Yeah.
Who would be a good pick and roll partner with Nate George because that's where you see Nate George really shine. Him and Brian Dongo really had a good pick and roll chemistry last year. And I think if you find a center to pair him with that also does that, he doesn't have to be a stretch five or anything, but I think somebody that can actually play those minutes because they just couldn't find anybody to do that. And I know Stoudamire wanted to get a lot of 3-and-D athleticism, length type guys last year. Didn't really work out that way. We might this might be a future podcast topic, but I don't really know if last year's transfer class really bore any fruit. I don't know that it really made a huge difference. I know Reeves, was a starter this season. He was pretty solid, but after him, it was kind of a crapshoot as far as guys. I think Gapari really came on down the stretch, and I think you saw that in the last Notre Dame loss in the ACC tournament about what he is able to do in terms of defense. He ran the floor really well. I thought he made some good passes in transition. I think defensively he really could get after it. But I think you need more guys that can get on the floor consistently. And I think, to your point, I think a veteran backup point guard wouldn't hurt at all. I think we all expect Nate George to go into the season next year as the starter, but to have a vet that can come off the bench and can give them minutes and can score. Because Kyle Stoudamire, look at the Florida State win at the end of the season. That was all him. He really stepped up and scored some of the games. He's a good free throw shooter. And you can't undervalue those leadership qualities and his ability to impact the game. You want a guy on that because, this isn't – you're not going to win with all freshmen. I know that's kind of like the Kentucky thing. You win with a lot of freshmen, but you look at what they're doing now. You need veteran players in there, and you need them to mix well with your young talent. Look, Stoudamire has the recruiting class up to 13th nationally, not in the ACC, nationally, and 4th in the ACC behind Duke, Carolina, and Miami. So their help is on the way in terms of young guys. I kind of want to see them make a couple of veteran additions through the portal. Just going off basketball talk for just a second, just, baseball has been struggling since we last were on air. They were riding hot. There was a 9-game winning streak. They swept NC State, who at the time was number 13, came back, beat Georgia State, and they had a chance to really make a statement last week against number 20 North Carolina, who is supposed to be one of the better teams in the ACC, especially like their pitching is really good, by the way. They fell flat in that series. They had a couple of close games, but were swept ultimately. The series against, or not the series, but the game against Kennesaw State on Tuesday was postponed, and most people won't look at that as a big deal, but Kennesaw State is pretty high in the RPI. That's a good baseball team right there. Like that would have been a chance to get a really good win, because outside of NC State, I don't really know that they have any. They weren't able to beat Georgia. They didn't beat North Carolina. And like Northeastern's actually a pretty good team. Like I know a lot of people frowned on that loss, but that was a team that's supposed to be pretty good. Another rocky start last night. The game was not close. Boston College is supposed to be one of the weaker teams in the ACC. Carson Ballard got to start last night. He was pulled pretty early. Like I think they got down 4-0. He was pulled, and then they added a couple of runs late. I think the final score wound up being 10-2. Game 2 of the series is tonight. They still have a chance to win the series. They'll play tomorrow and Saturday. Obviously, Easter's on Sunday, so they will not play then. They kind of got to right the ship. You got any big baseball thoughts?
Not really. Kind of looking back at the North Carolina series just for a second, though. None of those games, besides the first game, were relatively close. Tech came back actually in the first game and almost made it really interesting. Score ended up being 5-4. But heading into the last inning, like it was a 5-2 game. And one thing we also haven't talked about, Drew Burris has kind of blossomed into one of the best players in the country.
Yeah.
I saw a Baseball America mock draft earlier
He's
that had him number 1.
26
right
now. He's unbelievable. I hate to be all doom and gloom about baseball, because I was starting to get really invested and excited about him again, but the North Carolina series kind of was not great. Just the way they lost some of the games and the fact you got swept, and then losing by 8 runs to Boston College is just not great. Like baseball can be fluky. Like there's a lot of variance in there, and anybody can lose to anybody on any given night. Like Wake Forest, they've dropped a couple games you wouldn't, they were the number 1 team in the country coming in the year. They've dropped a couple games you wouldn't necessarily expect. But yeah, baseball is going to keep it rolling tonight against Boston College. We'll see how that goes. And then hopefully they can get back on track. But our main topic today was just kind of going over, we're not going to do, this isn't going to be an hour-long discussion, but I think just kind of putting a pin in Damon Stoudamire's first season, kind of what we expect going forward. This was one of the weirdest college basketball seasons from a team I can remember. And it's not going to get a lot of attention, but people have said, go look at the resumes, at the end of the tournament. I'm sure a lot of everybody looks at net rating, quad 1 wins, quad 2 wins. Georgia Tech had more quad 1 wins than Alabama, who is 1 win away from the Final Four. They had more quad 1 wins than Auburn, and had more than Gonzaga. Those are 3 teams. Alabama's still playing, Gonzaga plays tonight, and Auburn got upset in the first round. But those were 3 really, really good teams. And Georgia Tech had more quad 1 wins than all of them. They beat Clemson, who's in the Elite Eight. They beat North Carolina. They beat Duke. Should have beat Duke twice, I would argue, if some calls had gone their way in that second game. They beat Wake Forest. They beat Mississippi State, who made the tournament. But also just the losses were just – a lot of them were just gross. You had the UMass Lowell loss at the beginning of the year. I will say Brian Dongo was hurt and was not playing yet. Nate George was also not in the starting lineup in that game. I think if you make those, because I think they lost that game by 2 points, if I'm remembering correctly. If you had those 2 in the lineup, they probably don't lose, I wouldn't think, although it was early in the season. And so you had a nearly 40-point loss to Cincinnati, which, Cincinnati was a borderline tournament team. And I think they I don't know if they came into the year ranked or not, but everybody thought pretty highly of them coming into the year, and they wound up not making the tournament. But that was kind of a black mark. And then just, several blown ACC leads. Like, they blew a double-digit lead on the road at Louisville. They blew a double-digit lead at home to Boston College. You had a couple of ugly ones against Clemson and Wake Forest where it was like nearly a 30-point loss as well. You had 3 losses to Notre Dame. You had a loss to Florida State early on in conference play. The first matchup with Virginia, they blew a double-digit lead there. And I'll say a black mark is, especially after watching Virginia barely be able to function in that first 4 game. Virginia kind of had their way against Georgia Tech that very last game of the year and scored like 70-something points. Like, that's not good giving up that many points to Virginia. So I guess just your kind of first thoughts on the season as a whole, because it was just one of the craziest up and downs I can remember, because generally you'll get something consistent out of a team. Is like they can beat bad teams but not good teams. Maybe you get a couple of upsets here and there, but I just can't remember a team with this many good wins and just as many horrible losses.
Yeah, and like all of the Georgia Tech ACC wins, besides Miami, who was at one point one of the best teams in the ACC, all of the wins from Georgia Tech this year, besides Miami, were against the best teams in the conference. Like if you look at it, our record versus the top half of the conference is so much better than the bottom half of the conference, which is something that's really weird because this season was also really weird due to the fact that we didn't know who was going to play at the start of the season. And that changed a lot. And there wasn't, wasn't a ton of guys playing. Like most games, it was you had 7 guys playing if it was close, 8 if it wasn't. And like you said, I don't think I've seen a team like this, because you go out and beat North Carolina, who at the time was one of the best teams in the country.
No, I think they were number 3 when they beat them. I don't think they were number 1. Or am I remembering that wrong?
Yeah, they were up there though, and it's just really impressive to see that from a team who was filled with a lot of young guys, like Nate George, who wasn't even starting at the beginning of the season, was crucial in wins against really good teams like Clemson.
Yeah, and I think the point you made there at the top was really good. Like just the lineup changes throughout the start of the year, because we were just talking about Amari Abram kind of being the starter. He was talked about a lot in the offseason. He played those first few games and then you never really saw him again. Tyjon Claude, he played a lot at the beginning. He was kind of off and on throughout the rest. Like you said, it was this once the starting lineup really got settled in it, it was Nate George, Miles Kelly, Reeves, Brian Dongo, and Ebenezer would typically start in that last spot. But that last spot, they really kind of, you'd have 15, 16 minutes here. You'd have 15, 16 minutes there. Kyle Sturtevant played heavy minutes. There was a lot of the season you really didn't see Debo Coleman. And I thought he was a guy that, would play a lot more than he did. But yeah, it was, I'll say this, and it's a question I'll have for you. Like, I think there is enough to go off of right now. I know there was that frustrating point of the season when, I don't know if they lost like 7 of 9 or like 8 of 10. It was something like that, and a lot of them were close. But then there was a point where things started to go, they were getting blown out. Like there was Virginia Tech blew them out on the road. Wake Forest, you remember doing that podcast. Like
That's horrible.
They scored like 2 points in like the first 14 minutes of the game. Like they missed like 20 straight shots. Then you got blown out by Clemson, and then you're like, okay, is this team really trending downwards? And I remember after the Clemson game, you had the comment by Stoudamire, when I get my guys in here, it's going to be different. And, some people took that one way. Some people took it another. They did respond after that, though. Like that's when they won some games down the stretch, beating Miami, beating Florida State. Off the top of my head, I can't remember who else they beat there. And they also had, really close games like NC State. we're talking about them possibly getting to the Elite Eight. Georgia Tech was up double digits on the road at NC State, and then they fell apart. Like they lost some double digit leads this year. Where that the record could have been a lot better, and you could be talking about them as a top half team in the ACC and getting a bye in the first round. You know, I think they sort of kind of like the season. I would have never mapped it out the way it happened. Like I wouldn't have projected them to beat all those top teams and then lose to some of these teams. Like it probably would have been. I would have never picked them to lose to UMass Lowell or Boston College or Louisville. But I would also never picked them to beat North Carolina, Duke, Mississippi State. And remember that Mississippi State loss or the Mississippi State win, excuse me, was right off the heels of that UMass Lowell loss. And then they turned around, or I think it was a Cincinnati loss because they lost both those games back to back, I believe. And then beat Mississippi State and Duke back to back. And then, they made the run in that tournament in Hawaii and lost to Nevada, who made the tournament. And that was a close game throughout. So I would guess the season in terms of record met my expectations. I picked them to finish near the bottom of the ACC. It didn't, again, go quite the way I thought. But did the season meet your preseason expectations?
I think it was about where I was preseason. But one thing that was interesting to see, and you kind of touched on this, was the ups and downs throughout the season. Because after the Mississippi State and the Duke win, Georgia Tech was receiving votes to be a top 25 team.
Yeah.
And then that was inversely true through the rest of the year. You kind of look at it, and one thing I've made a connection with is this Georgia Tech season is like the inverse of the Miami season. At the end, Georgia Tech rallied and won a ton of games.
We both thought Miami quit.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Miami, at the end of the season, kind of gave up on playing basketball when early in the season, they were
a top 10 team at one point. Then I remember Kentucky blowing them out and things. We're starting to get some signs, but
it was mostly downhill from that Kentucky game. I think that was the point and where Miami had that downfall. But to talk about Georgia Tech, like I would have never predicted Georgia Tech would receive any votes for any kind of top 25.
Yeah, and I think some things to point out where I at least feel good about is, look, it's hard to win. I know Kentucky did it for a while. You've seen like Duke tries to play a lot of freshmen, but it's hard to win playing a lot of freshmen. And I think that's, once Stoudamire recognized how good George and Ndongo were, it was a full commitment to playing them, while also probably in the back of his mind going like, we're going to have to take our lumps here. And they did. And it wasn't like they were the Fab Five and starting 5 true freshmen, but, you had 2 guys playing. It wasn't like, and he outplayed his ranking, and recruiting rankings are everything, but Nate George wasn't exactly a highly rated 5-star point guard or anything, that he kind of came on late for Tech. And, Ndongo was a 4-star. They pulled him away from Rutgers after hiring Carl Hobbs as an assistant coach. But look, you had the wins, which showed that they can play up to an opponent. You had to play the freshmen. And then, we've talked about this several times. Like the recruiting class is really good. Jaden Mustaf, they added a kid recently. Like, and they might not be done yet. I know Daquan Davis chose Florida State. I think that was the way that was trending for a while. I don't know that Tech was really in it there at the end, but they have the 4th ranked recruiting class in the ACC, 13th nationally. You bring those in, and let's see if they can build off of it. Like, I think just finding some consistency and trying not to lose. The one thing I was disappointed in coming into the year, I was hoping beat several of these teams that are either in the middle or in the back half. And then, the rest will take care of itself because, I think me and you both considered North Carolina and Duke to be a lot better than everybody in the ACC. And then, Virginia had its moments this year. Clemson and Wake Forest were both talented. Pitt really started surging towards the middle of the year. But it was just how they played, blowing a 16-point lead to Boston College, blowing a lead to a god-awful Louisville team. And Kenny Payne's out of there now, by the way. So, losing 3 games to Notre Dame, who was not good at all. Losing to Florida State was not a great loss. So blowing a lead on the road to NC State. So there were good moments throughout, but I think it's just finding a way to beat those other teams in the ACC, because losing a close game to Duke on the road like they did and losing close to Virginia both times, that doesn't hurt you in the big picture of things. It's when you start piling up those other losses, because like the point I was making about all their quad one wins, go look at some of the losses they have, and it stands out as well, when you look at their overall profile. But I think there's definitely some things to be excited about. Now, there's a lot of work that has to be done. I'm not sitting here saying that we have to forget the bad things or the frustrating things that came from this season, but I think that the things that were good, I think there's more good than bad. I'll say that, and I know that seems weird for a team that had a below 500 record, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, and there were some really like rough moments. Like you lose to a team like Notre Dame 3 times in a season, and that can't be good for morale, no matter how good, how bad of a team you are. Losing 3 times in a season hurts, and especially like that last game we talked about earlier, the pick and roll with Brian Dongo and Nate George was so good, and then in the final moments of the Notre Dame game, the last one, that's where we fell short. But I think that's something, that was so good all season, and I don't want that to, kind of taint the image, because the pick and roll was great all season. So I really think if you clean up some of the small things, Georgia Tech has a chance to be a lot higher in the ACC standings than they were this year.
Yep. Like I'm excited. At least it's true in football. I know a lot of people say, the biggest jump in a coaching tenure is generally between year 1 and year 2. Maybe that's true for Damon Stoudamire. Hopefully for Georgia Tech fans, that's true, and we'll see kind of what transpires. But the portal's open. I know there's one recruit there. They're still actively trying to get for the 2024 class, and it'll be on to 2025. And that's another thing is, while we say we don't want freshmen playing a ton, this is a good opportunity to start stacking classes together, get these top 15. Maybe see, I don't think there's really anything they can do now to get them in the top 10, but put another top 15 recruiting class together next offseason, and then keep developing these guys, and we'll see what happens. But anything we're missing in terms of talking about this past basketball season? Because after this, I'm done. I don't want to talk about this past basketball season anymore.
Yeah, well, I think I saw somebody do the math. I think Georgia Tech, if they get Pippen in their recruiting class, I think they're 11th. So I think they will be just shy of a top 10 recruiting class this year, no matter what.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know how much, because I knew they were nipping at Miami's heels for 12th. I didn't know if they could do anything to get to 11th. So that's interesting. And again, but it's the best recruiting class, at least in the 247 sports rankings, I believe, since like 2012. Like, because the recruiting has been really down for a long time. You had a couple of hits here and there, but really, like, throughout it's not been very good. So we'll definitely that's huge for Stoudamire. But who was actually at the Hawks game this Monday, and it won't surprise anybody. The Hawks were playing the Boston Celtics this week, and Stoudamire, of course, was an assistant coach there. And Boston, I believe, was practicing at Tech. I believe I saw some videos of Jason Tatum giving interviews, and I saw the Georgia Tech logos in the background. So that was just a random note that I love to share on these podcasts. So anything else, RJ, as we wrap up this show?
Nothing really.
Okay. Well, like I said, go check out All Yellow Jackets for more spring practice coverage. We're going to be back talking more Georgia Tech next week. And then, regular stuff. If you're watching this on YouTube, we would love you to like the video, subscribe to the channel. If you're listening on podcast, be sure to give us a review, subscribe to the podcast as well. We love making this content for you guys. We'll be doing once a week, probably up to football season. And then, you'll start to see some more episodes come more frequently is the word I was trying to find there. But we love the support. Let us know how we're doing. Let us know what you want to see on the show, and we will try to make it as good as we can for you guys. But that'll do it for us on the Bleav Georgia Tech podcast. That's RJ Schaefer. I'm Jackson Caudill. Appreciate you guys listening, and see you next time.